So today we want to touch on two things, the U.S. industrial policy and infrastructure in the U.S. to kind of give a quick lead into what Andy and the gang are going to cover after. So, when you go back to the 90s, basically, and the launch of the Chinese economic growth engine, you saw a carving out of the U.S. manufacturing base starting back then. And this is the manufacturing employment in the U.S. in decline. And then all of a sudden you start to see it leveling out around the great financial crisis. In the last couple of years is certainly in an uptrend as we're bringing jobs back home. And a lot of that is really due to the wage policies. But it really is one of the big changes, as you can see, and this is a chart of production workers' average salaries in 2022. And you can see on the far left, Germany, the US, and the UK, most of the West really at elevated levels. And on the other end of the spectrum, you see India, Mexico, Vietnam, and Malaysia, and Thailand, where all the manufacturing is really moving to. I think the big change is really China being in the middle, where it was the lowest cost provider. Now it's trying to move up the value chain. And that's actually changing really the terms of global trade around the world as they're moving up the value chain, creating more opportunities for people on the low end. And at the same time, you have the increase in technology, lowering production costs and substituting capital for labor at a pretty aggressive rate, which is allowing business to come back to the US. So I think there's some big changes going on that are driving some shifts. This is another look at just the differential between Vietnam, China, and the US in 22. And you can see why Vietnam is attracting so much. And while China is losing its edge as the lowest cost provider, which is part of their strategy to move up the value chain, but they're kind of in that in-between period where they have to make the break into the upper ranks and keep moving those dollars up, or they become a higher cost, not an extra efficient production source, and that means you'll lose some of the production from there. And I think a big part of what's creating the shift that we're seeing going on is the policy decisions made out of the US. So I can give you basically 4 trillion reasons why money is flowing differently than it had previously. The American Rescue Plan was 1.9 trillion. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was 1.2. Chips and Science Act, about $500 billion. You have the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives benefits to companies upwards of another $500 billion, and we continue to raise our defense spending. And they're all somewhat related about the changing terms of trade. It's about protecting the country from the economy, from adversarial bad actors. It's also about dealing with the way the global economy is shifting and dealing with two of the big issues that we're facing today that we really didn't have before, this climate transition that's going on at a much more aggressive pace, and the advent of AI, generative AI, and what that can do to offset productivity issues that we've been experiencing. So you're seeing a big shift in spend, and this chart shows you a comparison of the GDP expenditure on R&D for the EU, the US, China, and Japan. And at the top, you can see the US and Japan, which are running really upwards of 3% plus of GDP and R&D. And you can see with the US, it's moving up. A lot of that is the inflation, is these acts that we're talking about. It continues to move up in China, although it's levering off. Of concern is the reduction of R&D spend in the EU. And I think this gets to some competitiveness issues that we see going on around the world. And as a result of the policies, you're seeing businesses move back to the US as reshoring and foreign direct investment has picked up. I do think when we see the 23 numbers, you may start to see a slowing of the percent. One, because a lot of people move very quickly to do it. And two, because you are starting to get a better sense of how things are shifting. China is starting to give better signs of reopening. We have a better sense of how the work from home is starting to evolve. But you're starting to see changes. And I think companies are running into some bigger challenges. So it's not as easy to make some of the changes that were occurring as well. So I think you're going to see a bit of a slowdown of this, but the changes are quite real, and they are being felt throughout the global system. So there has been a lot of money thrown at it. I said there's trillions of dollars. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this is just a sense of where we are. And you can see that from formula direct spend versus competitive bidding. So what the government could automatically get out into the system versus what has to go to competitive bidding is in the gold and the blue. And you can see some pretty significant money has been put into the system, but the gray is what's left. So we have an opportunity in the US where investments are going to continue to flow from these programs for the rest of the decade. And that is a nice runway. And when you think about why is the economy doing so much better than people feel it should be doing this year, I think the amount of spend that we throw at the problem is a big part of it. I think the other part of it is that some of the issues of the tightening that's going on are being offset by the amount of stimulus, both monetary and fiscal, that have hit the system, and the lag effect of monetary policy will be felt next year and the year after more so, which is why we're so strong. What this chart's showing is that for all the negative politics we have in the US and the divisiveness, that the money is not flown to Democratic states versus Republican states by the mandate. It's actually flown really pretty much where it's favored the Republican states considerably, which would be a bit of a surprise given the administration's position. So I think what you're seeing is money flowing into the areas that are most open to receiving the areas and are acting the fastest to move on the stimulus that's out there and take advantage of the money that's out there. But there is big money being put to it. Over 680 billion was already announced by the private sector, and you can see where it's flowing to. You can see when you add to it the trade and investment that's coming through from public and private, and how much you're seeing new opportunities, money getting put to work into the U.S. system. You can see how our economy continues to attract capital and continues to grow. I think one of the interesting things that came out of Brookings is when you think about where these money is flowing and what's changed from where it was before, and just looking at the semiconductor and electronics area, you're seeing a shift away from the former hubs of, Seattle, the Valley, Boston, these parts of the East Coast, to much more flowing to rest of the nation. And I think as that continues to happen, that's a reflection of the changes of work from home since the pandemic. It's a reflection of the changes of the stimulus programs that are being put in place, and the ability to attract business into these areas, I think, is a big part of the shift that's going on. And that has big implications for the infrastructure system, as we'll talk about now. So when you think about this shift, and this is every 4 years, the American Society of Civil Engineers produces a report card on the infrastructure for the US. In 2021, the title of the report was A Failure to Act. And it really looked at the declines that we've had by not putting enough money into the infrastructure system over the years. And remember, after World War II, that was one of the big areas, World War I and World War II, we put a lot of money into the infrastructure system, which allowed us to really take off as a nation. Unfortunately, a lot of the areas that we've made the big investments in are reaching their end of the useful life, and we're still underinvested and woefully underinvested in the opportunity. I would point out that this grade of a C- is an improvement over the last several years of reports. They do this every 4 years, and they've done it for some. I think its first one started in 1997. So you can see these grades are terrible, and we'll get into some of them one by one as we go through them. So let me take a look at what the impact is. So the title of the report was Failure to Act, the economic impact of the status quo investment on our infrastructure systems. And what it says is we're paying, really investing half of what's required. The gap now is at 2.5 trillion over the next decade, and it continues to grow. When they first did the report in 2021, they looked at the first report, the gap grew by $400 billion. The gap stood at $400 billion. Now the gap has grown from 2001 to today, where it's 2.5 trillion in 2021 and continues to grow. And the cost is real. They're suggesting that failure to act would cost 10 trillion on the economy by 2029. it would cost over 3 million jobs by 2039, and we're losing 2.4 trillion in exports over the next 20 years. And the cost to households is real. That 3,300 a year is what they're estimating the cost to be from the lack of investment, underinvestment that we're making. So here's a look at the different areas and the gap in what is funded and what the funding gap that remains. And this is the cumulative effect from 2020 to 2029. And you're looking at $2.5 trillion of gaps around key areas: surface transportation, drinking water, which we know we've had the problems with Flint, electricity, and that's where the grid comes in that they Andy and the team are going to talk about in a minute, and then the school system, which we know our grades continue to slide in the U.S. So I want to just touch on 4 of these areas and give you some highlights, and we can get into some of the numbers on it in a minute. But so you can see the bridges are old. Most 42% are over their useful life. There are about 620,000 bridges in the U.S., and 7.5% of them are structurally deficient. And when they do this report, they create these standards of what does it take to get the system into a state of good repair. That doesn't mean it's excellent or everything's good. It just means that it's safe and useful to drive over. It's not state of the art. And this just shows you the decline that we continue to see in bridges that are going, and the weather continues to make this a bigger challenge as it puts greater strains on the system. If you go to the drinking water, that's another area. So in the US, we use about 39 billion gallons of water a day, or about 82 gallons per person a day. We're seeing water main breaks every 2 minutes. It's costing massive, and the pipes can go back over 100 years or 200 years in some cases in New York City. So we have massive upgrades that need to go on there and to protect our system. And it's absolutely essential to the economy's well-being to get drinking water in standard. When you look at the roads, that's another area, and the systems now, 43% are in poor or mediocre condition. And what's bad about that is those roads had seen an increase in traffic going on them. So we have a greater decline in the quality of the roads and the safety of the roads, and we're seeing more motorists driving on them every day. And vehicle miles are starting to cost us. The damage and repairs and the degradation on the auto system adds about 130 billion per year in excess costs to the system. So really, the lack of investment is coming back to us in much higher cost every year. And now we'll get to the energy and the grid. So you can see the spending is going up on the high voltage transmission lines from 15, almost 16 billion in 12 to almost 22 billion in 17, and continues to rise. But to put it in perspective, we have about 600,000 miles of what they call high voltage transmission lines of the backbone of that element of the system. And we have about 5.2 million miles of kind of the last mile, the local distribution. 70% of our transmission system is in its second half of its useful life. So you can expect bigger problems coming from that part of the system. And as Andy and the team will tell you, our system is not a smooth, easy to fix uniform grid system. It's actually multiple grid systems and microgrid systems that are by design not very efficient. And just thinking about our power lines and the rest, where we still have our lines above ground, you can see where the challenges continue to rise. And the other element is with the changes that have occurred with populations moving from the pandemic, we're starting to see bigger living in areas that are not the areas that the system was designed for the high population areas. And how do we redistribute and redirect that is going to be one of the challenges going forward. So I'm going to leave you with one last thought, because how do you position portfolios for 2024? And while tech has driven the markets, and NASDAQ's up some 44% year to date, we think tech is driving productivity and broadening out into other industries. So we really think about tech not from just the fangs in the market, but we're seeing a nice broadening out of the markets. It's gradual, but it is improving. And we think tech is going to be the determinant for how businesses in every sector deal with the productivity improvements they need to make to deal with the rising costs they're going to have. We still enjoy the energy transition and companies on both sides of that because they're both essential to make this transition happen. We think the materials area continues to be an exciting area, even though it has not been a high performer this year. We think that certain policies and the changing terms of trade are going to continue to drive that. China just announced the other day that they're looking at limiting the export of certain technologies for the rare earth value chain that are going to make it more difficult for the West to access the technologies to refine rare earths, which makes the handful of companies outside China more valuable. We think the reindustrialization and the global tensions that exist are going to make industrials more attractive, but they're also going to increase the inflationary pressures as we're really running dual systems in many cases. So we think that's a really exciting area, but one you have to be very thoughtful about how you play. And then you have biotech and pharma companies continuing to help us live longer, and the advances continue to be phenomenal. We are excited about that. But one of the things I'd leave you with is we love when you can have black and white answers. We like the economy to either be in a recession or to be in a growth mode. We like the Fed to be lowering rates or raising rates or holding rates flat. We don't like the uncertainty. But the reality is the world is really gray and going to be much grayer next year. We are in the midst of two wars with a potential of conflict for a third area coming. We have 42% of the world going to world's GDP and world's population going to have national elections held next year. We're seeing big shifts from the far left to the far right in some of the early election results that could have big implications for us. So while it feels really good right now, we've had a big year in the markets and everything feels good. I would say that this is a time to be really defensive, but opportunistic at the same time. I think the opportunities are broadening out, but you really have to be careful to get caught up in the hype. So Mark, I'm going to stop there. Went a little long, but it sets us up for Andy's session. Mark is able to take
so, comments, questions? Anyone?
Michael, I don't have the answer to your question about the against annual wages.
But you understand why I'm asking that.
Yep. China has moved up, but I don't think they've broken through to the levels that they need to. They've moved past the $6,000 level, but they haven't gotten to the above 20 yet. And I think that's one of the things that they really need to see, that per capita GDP move up to a much higher rate. But I do think the real issue is that their real cost advantage has gone away, partially by design. And how do they deal with that is going to be one of the keys.
I have one question,
Yep.
maybe a bit convoluted. You mentioned education as being an issue, which I wholly agree with. I read an article last week or 2 weeks ago with regards to couple of projects in the US to build semiconductor chip facilities, actual foundries. And the biggest hurdle, apparently, is a lack of skilled workers to build these things. Building these factories is not like building anything else, because it is as high-end, as high-tech of a building as you can find anywhere of the world, and especially on the basis of the air quality, which has to be absolutely pure. So that brings up the issue, this is at scale. We're not talking about a few hundred workers. We're talking about thousands. In general, the West, certainly North America, seems to be unable to catch up with the level of technical expertise of let's call it non-university skills, which are absolutely essential to build anything. How do you see this being addressed in the US? We're not kind of talking Canada. Canada is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. But in the US, how do you address this shortage of skill set at the builders level? We don't need more lawyers or more. In fact, we don't even need more engineers. We don't need more doctors. We don't need university grads with useless degrees. We need people who can build and manufacture stuff. How do you address this issue, or can it be addressed? Education.
Ken, we've gotten away in the U.S. from the vocational skills training in high schools and junior highs. The elementary educational system needs to be returned to more hands-on skills training for the people who want to go that course. We don't do very good vocational development in the U.S. As opposed to, say, Europe and other areas, and we could do a much better job there. I think it's a mindset change, though. We had the view that everyone needed an MBA since the 80s, and I think we have to move away from that. Nothing against MBAs; we need those too, but we need to match up the skills to the needs throughout the system. And I think when you get into the electrical grid, one of the big problems for us moving faster to make the transition there is our big power companies have a skills problem, and getting the linemen and the technical engineers to do that is one of the problems you'll hear from Quanta Services. One of the big service providers in the transmission system in the U.S. has that problem as well. So I think it's getting back to skills, and I also think it gets to immigration. Immigration policy needs to have people coming in for the jobs you need to fill with the skills you need.
But do you think the education system itself is aware and willing to go that way? Aware of this requirement and willing to change?
If you look at our university system, I would say the U.S. educational system needs a rewrite, and it needs to redo because it's lost its way. I really think it has. I think we got to get back to the core principles of educating our young people, not the ideological ones we're using. So what's education supposed to do? It's teach them how to think and how to learn and learn skills, and we're not doing that right now very well.
Like at Gettysburg.
Yes, learn how to learn. Liberal arts.
Any other questions?
So just to follow up to what Stephen was asking, and being in Ohio where Intel's doing those chip fabs, they're making huge efforts because, just building those fabs, there's a shortage of plumbers, of electricians. And so they are training people, but it takes a while to train people. They're making it easier for electricians and plumbers from other states to come in, making the licensing process easier. So I think when it comes to things like the chip fabs, yes, there are pain points, but I don't think it's as bad as some might think. Someone was giving a presentation just for the Intel chip fab. They need as many electricians and plumbers as there are in the region, right? Setting aside any other construction. That's just massive. And then, Stephen, to your point about the linemen, there's about 120,000 linemen in the U.S. A large chunk of those are approaching retirement age. And that's a huge problem. The average wage for linemen is $60 an hour across the U.S. There's variations, but people can make good money without going to college.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the changes that's going to come out of the financial problems that people have and the debt problems from a lot of the student loan debt. People are going to realize it was very unproductive spend relative to the return. And that'll shift to where some of these vocational skills will be developed better at earlier ages. People forego the college education.
Rob Colorina, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Mark and Steve. Just a quick question with respect to healthcare and how you guys are doing a portfolio construct around healthcare, Steve. I'll be in California some next week with some of the healthcare things going on there. Can you speak a little to that? And it could be as broad as from biotech to devices.
Yeah, we're approaching it cautiously is the only way you can do it right now, because in the biotech area, they are purely binary outcomes. So you really have to do the research and really roll up your sleeves on it. We like a couple of the companies that are doing really interesting things like increasing the healthcare outcome by lengthening out the efficacy of one injection versus 7. So a company called Ascendis, really good at that. We do like some of the device companies, but we're not comfortable with the valuations on them right now. And in big pharma, you really have to be careful. There's a big haves and have-nots there. The guys who have the weight loss drugs are killing it, and everyone else is dealing with patent portfolios that have big roll-offs on it. So there's really a scramble right now, and that's why you're seeing deals like Bristol Myers doing 2 transactions in a week, which they haven't really done those in this area in quite some time, or AstraZeneca just announced another one. So I think a big area for M&A, but it's one that we're going cautiously. We're selecting the names one by one. It's a tough area right now.